All right, thanks. Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll go ahead and launch this really quick here. Thanks for coming to Power Query Data Chemistry for the Masses. Mark Valancourt, I'm with Tailwind Technologies, and this is a session that I did at Past Summit 2014 as well. I just put this up here so that you know you don't have to learn how to spell Valancourt to get in touch with me. I'm Mark VSQL pretty much everywhere, and I do have my own hashtag. Mark VSQL is handsome and witty. Feel free to use that on Twitter anytime you like. So the agenda for today, we're going to start with an introduction to data chemistry and kind of what inspired this presentation. And then from there, we're going to move on to preparing a laboratory. So I did kind of take the data chemistry aspect of this kind of far in a fun way. So we're going to prepare the laboratory, setting up Power Query, setting up Excel so that you can do what you have to do. We're going to talk about various chemical reactions, basically the things that you can do with data inside Power Query. I liken them to some common chemical reaction types. We're going to talk about distillation, which is largely about removing impurities, etc., but you can figure out what that's going to be about. And then we're going to do a little bit of advanced topics, and then a little bit about laboratory safety. So let's start diving right in with our introduction to data chemistry. So typically when I'm doing a presentation, I don't read, but since these are quotes, I'm gonna. So chemistry is, well, technically chemistry is the study of matter, but I prefer to see it as the study of change. Elements, they combine and change into compounds. It is growth, then decay, then transformation. And if you are familiar with the show Breaking Bad, then you have a pretty good idea who said that. That would be Mr. Walter White, one of the more famous American chemists, at least in recent history, who made some very interesting professional development choices. So with chemistry being the study of matter and the study of the matter's properties, its interactions, its transformations, to me that's a lot like what ETL is in terms of the data world, right? So in terms of the properties of data and how to manipulate those properties to be in the shape that you want them to be for your analysis, etc. Okay? So in the enterprise world, we do that with SQL Server Integration Services, which is a really powerful tool. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold, so I might be doing that a little bit. Excuse me. It's very full-featured. It's albeit it's a little complex. It's definitely intended for ETL developers. So your typical business user is not going to sit down and start building out SSIS packages. Power Query, on the other hand, it's really intended more for the business user to at least get started with. There's fewer features. It's a lot simpler to use. But at the same time, it's still incredibly powerful, and I'm really excited about it. So at least up through Excel 2013, Power Query is a separate download from Microsoft. It's free. Just look for a Power Query download in your search engine of choice, and you can go and download it, and it'll be an add-in for Excel. Once you've done that, you're gonna have a little Power Query option in your Excel ribbon that you'll be able to click into and see the various options that you have. Excuse me. For starting to work with Power Query. Some of these screenshots are a little bit old. Power Query is one of those tools that's updated a bit more frequently than Excel is. For a while there, we were getting just about monthly updates. So some of this gets outpaced. Poor Chris Webb. Chris Webb wrote a great Power Query book, and the whole time he was writing it, they would come up with a new version of Power Query, and he's like, I got to redo a bunch of screenshots. Poor guy. So in terms of when we're thinking about this, one of the things that we do to start working with Power Query is we extract, right? We take our data from its current location, and we want to bring it into Power Query to start working with it. So that's like the extract phase of ETL. Once it's in Power Query, we can start doing transformations on that data. We can start shaping it differently. And, you know, Power Pivot, since it came out, has had a lot of options for bringing data into it. One weakness of Power Pivot is that you have to get the data essentially into the data model before you can start working with it. So it's going to take up space in your data model even if it's something that you don't necessarily want. The great thing about Power Query is it lets you shape and manipulate, transform that data before you get it into the data model at all. So even if you're pulling from a big text file, you don't have to bring in the whole text file. You can just bring in the parts you want, and you can shape that data the way you need to. In terms of loading, Power Query right now, the destination options you have are all within Excel. You can't like write out to a SQL Server database or anything like that, at least at this juncture. That would be so slick. So here we have the most interesting man in the world. So you have a couple of load options that we're going to get to in more detail, but pretty much the one that comes the most recommended is loading it to the data model in Excel, which is essentially the Power Pivot model behind the scenes in Excel. There's a lot of advantages to that, including taking advantage of the compression that Power Pivot, offers in terms of the X-Velocity engine, etc. It also opens up the ability to start using DAX, which is just awesome. So you have a lot more freedom in dumping into the data model instead of just to a worksheet in Excel. Excuse me. The default, at least at this point, is to Power Query will default to wanting to load it to a worksheet. You can actually change that default behavior, and I'll show you how to do that really quick, so that you're not going to a worksheet, you're just going to the data model. So once you get inside Power Query, and once you've pointed to a source, and now you're in Power Query, the layout is essentially you have the Query Editor toolbar across the top, or the Query Editor ribbon, which is, very familiar Office look and feel to it. This is where you have a massive amount of options that you can do on your data. Power Query is one of those tools that, kind of in the sense that SQL Server Management Studio, the buttons that you can click within SQL Server Management Studio a lot of the times are going to be generating T-SQL code behind the scenes. With Power Query, the buttons that you click in the ribbon are actually generating M, or Power Query formula language code behind the scenes. That said, the vast majority of what you're going to want to accomplish, or what most people want to accomplish, you can actually do with the ribbon. It's got a tremendous amount of functionality. You can also, this is an optional feature that you can hide or turn on if you want to, is the formula bar. This is where you can actually see the M code that will be executed for the currently selected query step. And this is actually really handy. This is the results pane. So what this shows you is the end result of the currently selected step. After it's been applied, you see the result in this pane. And you can actually walk back through time through the applied steps, and I'll show you that as well, to see what the different results would look like at different phases in your journey here. Excuse me. So in the query settings, this is where you can actually name the query. And when you actually do close and load the query, the name that's in this name box here is actually the name of the table that's going to be created. And here you also have the applied steps, which is kind of like a time machine and just a brilliant idea for some self-documentation for the query itself, so that you don't have to necessarily do as much documentation because everything you've done is documented here. Power Query does it for you, and you can walk through it, whether it be for yourself or for somebody else. You can see every step that was taken and exactly what was done. It's kind of excellent. So let's do a little bit of demo here. I'm going to open up Power Query, open up Excel. So this is Excel for Office 365. And I'll just open up a blank workbook. You can see I've got the Power Query option right up here in the ribbon. Thank you, Zoom It. Gotta love Zoom It. So I'm going to go ahead and click this guy, and I'm going to go ahead and click into options here. So under settings, there's options. This interface looks a little bit different than the one I had in my slides, but the section we're going to focus on for a moment is right down here. I think it's Shift that I want. No, it's Control. Yep, there we go. Is this section right here where you can specify your query load settings. So right now the default is to load to a worksheet and not the data model. Basically, I changed those so that by default I load to the data model and not a worksheet. You can also load nowhere, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like as well, which is pretty cool. So that's just getting started. You have a lot of options up here for getting data. So you can go from the web, from a series of file options. Some of these I'm going to show you. You can go from a lot of different databases. They have a separate section here for the Azure sources that you can pull from. And then you've got this big long list of from other sources. One of the things you can do in here is a blank query. So if you are really adventurous and you're way cooler than me and you want to type your own M code just directly into the interface, you can do that. Or you can paste it in. That's really cool. But you can pull from a lot of different sources here. Some of the more recent ones are the Salesforce objects and reports. I played with these a little bit at my last employer, which was kind of fun. So it was a good time. So that's getting started with Power Query, preparing the laboratory, as it were. So we're going to move on to start talking a little bit about chemical reactions. So some common chemical reaction types, one of them is synthesis, the idea of taking two or more substances and putting them together to form a compound, you know, kind of like A plus B yields AB. You see that with, you know, sodium and chlorine making sodium chloride. And you might think of it in terms of ETL. You might be combining a first name and a last name to yield a full name field, right? So you're essentially doing synthesis on those data elements. Decomposition essentially just goes the other way, where you can break up A, B to yield A and B separately, you know. And similarly, if you're breaking up sodium chloride into sodium chlorine, or, you know, if you're breaking up a full name field into a first name and last name. So this is, you know, pretty rudimentary stuff, but you get the idea where the chemistry came in here. So largely this session was inspired by a field trip I took with my daughter. I was able to chaperone a field trip to the University of Minnesota, and they did a lot of cool demonstrations and taught a lot of cool stuff to fifth graders about chemistry in general, a little bit of physics in there. And the whole time I'm sitting there, I just started putting things together with data, and this session was born. So, excuse me, chemical reactions. Let's go look at that. So what I'm going to do is I want to bring in a little bit of data, show you a couple different options. One of the things you can do is with this online search is, for example, I can look up Nobel Prize winners, not whiners. I got a Nobel Prize. So I'm going to do Nobel Prize winners, and here we have, against Wikipedia, we see a list of the Nobel Peace Prize laureates, and I can click edit and start a query on that. So this online search is really cool. There is definitely a limited list of websites that have been indexed by Microsoft to be able to be used with this. There are things like the World Bank, Wikipedia. There's a lot of data.gov. I have a link on my blog, and I did a series on Power Query that links out to the site at Microsoft where they list out the sources that you can use with this online search. So for now, I'm just going to close that up. And from web, I'll show you in a little bit. From file, this is your typical stuff. You can import from various files. I want to show you really quick the from folder, because this is a really cool feature that I'm a big fan of. And I need to go OneDrive and presentations. So sometimes you're in the situation where maybe you have a regular export or something that just spits out the same structure file to a folder. Maybe you get a new one every day or something like that. In my case, I have a folder here that inside has a text file with one file for each category of Nobel Prize. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click OK, pointed just to that folder. What Power Query is going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to find all those files and let me combine them into a single data set with this little combine button. So now all the files are basically appended one on top of the other, which is really, really cool. So this is great. The files have to have the same structure. That's really important. You're going to start getting really weird data. But this is a great option if you have, say, 100 files that you need to import with Power Query. You don't have to do each one. You can actually just put them all in a single folder and go ahead and use this. Now this tool will also go into subfolders within the folder you point to, so just keep that in mind. So in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and discard that. We don't want to keep that one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go through and start doing the cool stuff. So I'm going to go to From Web here, and what I have is the URL for an API for the Nobel Prize organization, and it's using JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. So I actually started playing with this. This was probably 2 weeks before Past Summit when I actually discovered being able to use JSON here, and it was before I could intelligently explain what JSON was. So what I'm going to show you is consuming a JSON API with Power Query with no code. No code at all. If I had to do this with code, I'd be hard-pressed, and I'd have to do a lot of research, and I certainly wouldn't be doing it over the course of a couple of minutes here in a demo. At least not today. So here we have it found a list. So we have in JSON, we have our list of what the objects are. I'm going to go ahead and convert it to a table. Now we have this little option here, this combine button. So I'm going to start combining and expanding and drilling in further. And now I'm going to expand it again. And we can see within each of these records, here are the various fields that we have. No, I still haven't typed any code. And I already turned the URL into an obviously meaningful data set. I can expand it further because there's values within prizes and there's records within there, because just a unique list of laureates is not enough, because there are people who have won more than one Nobel Prize. Notably, Marie Curie actually won one for chemistry, one for physics. How awesome is that? Oh, that's so cute. You only have one Nobel Prize. How amazing must that be? So now I've expanded further, and now I have the categories and the years and the prize share, the motivation. There's further levels we can go to, but I'm not going to bother with those because we don't need them. And I just turned the URL into a data set, and I typed no code. I didn't type any code at all. This is so awesome to me, and it completely blows me away. So what I would like to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to only choose the columns that I want. So I want the first name, take the surname, when they were born, born country code. So I don't want to capture their information about their death. That's a little morbid. Prize year, prize category, and prize share. So I've selected these. What I can do on this Remove Columns button here at the bottom, I can actually choose to remove other columns. So basically I've selected the columns I want to keep, and now I can choose Remove Other Columns, and they're gone. Now I only have the columns that I want. Really easy way to start playing with stuff. So one of the things that I like to do as soon as possible, once I get the columns that I'm going to work with, is I rename things to be what I want them to be right away. So I'm going to change this column name to first name, because right now they have prefixes based on they were all came from the value list, and they were expanded, and I don't like any of these column names. So I've changed the first one, and if you know up here in the formula bar here, you can see that we did a table.rename columns. This is what happened behind the scenes. Now, just to prove to you that you can actually paste in M code here, and it will just execute it, and so that you don't have to watch me type, which would not be exciting for any of us, is I actually have a step with all the renaming done. I'm just going to paste it right in here, and I'm going to hit enter, and it renamed all my columns for me. So everything behind the scenes is M, and it's really, really cool. So I was able to rename all those columns, and you didn't have to watch me type. To me, that's a huge deal. So I'm going to go, we're going to name the query over here in the properties. I'm going to call it laureate, and I'm going to click close and load. And what this is going to do is it's going to save it out because of my defaults that I selected. It's going to save it out to the data model. You can see it's loading the data right now, and we have 895 rows. And now that query with the name that I chose shows up in this workbook queries pane, which you can turn on or off with this little button here under Power Query, workbook queries, show pane. Okay, really cool. So now let's do this. Let's go back into it. Excuse me. And we're going to start doing some fun transformations. So for now, I want to look at, say, this gender column and the prize category. These are all in lowercase, which is fine. But for a solution that I want end users to look at, I kind of want to make it look a little nicer. So I did Control-click to select both of these columns, and now I can go to the Transform tab across the top, and I can change the format. And they have several options here. I can make it all lowercase if it's not. I can make it all upper. I can basically do the camel case type situation where each word will be capitalized. Trim and clean are about dealing with spaces and non-printing characters. For now, what I want to do is I just want to go to capitalize each word. So now if you look at these columns, you can see that male, female, etc. are capitalized, as are all the categories. Now, I'm going to delete that for a second. So if you look over here in the applied steps, you can see all the steps that we've taken on this query from the source itself. We've converted it to a table. We did a bunch of expands. I got rid of columns. We renamed some columns. And now we capitalized each word. So you can see that in the query steps. So I can actually go back to the renamed columns. You can see this is now before the capitalization happened. I can see go back before we removed the other columns. So all the columns, or before we did the rename, so the columns are there. If we go back before that, now we have all the columns again. So again, the applied steps is just an amazingly awesome feature to be able to walk through and see exactly what happened at each phase. You can also insert new steps. So if I come back to convert to table and I do something here, it'll insert a step. Just be wary when doing that because you could be affecting downstream steps and you could break some of those steps. So you can do it, you just have to do it with caution, that's all. So now we've capitalized those. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at prize share. So right now, this column, because Power Query wasn't sure what to do with it, this column ended up with the any data type. So this is the data type that Power Query uses when it's not really sure what to do for a data type for a column, and it doesn't want to try to impose one necessarily. So what I'm going to do is with prize share selected, I'm going to go to the data type, and I'm going to make it a whole number. So this prize share has to do with how much of that particular Nobel Prize each of the laureates won, because it does get divided out. So we're going to add a new column here, okay? So I'm going to go to the add column, and we're going to add a custom column. So I'm going to add a brand new column. In this interface, this is where the M code happens. And so that you don't have to watch me type, I'm once again going to go grab it and paste it in. So here's the M code for our new column. And it's going to be called entity type. And now I'll zoom in a little bit. So what's happening here is I'm saying if the gender column is equal to org, because in this data, the gender column contains male, female, or org. So organizations obviously in and of themselves don't have a gender, but they decided to put that all in one column anyway. So I'm making a new column that says if the gender is equal to org, then output a string organization, otherwise call it individual, and I'm giving it the name entity type. So this new column is going to have the entity type name. Notice that my if and the then and else are all lowercase. M is case sensitive, and Power Query in general is case sensitive, which if you're not used to that is going to drive you nuts, as it did me when I was first starting to type these. Because I know in T-SQL, reserved words, I always capitalize them, and I started doing that here, and it created nothing but pain. So just know that M is case sensitive. If you put capital I-F, it's not going to know what you're talking about. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So now we have our entity type column, and which is really cool. And it's actually not the column I wanted to create right now. I wanted to create a different one. So let's go create a different one since I got ahead of myself. This one, what I want to do is based on the prize share column. You can see there's ones and twos and fours in there. This is going to be called prize percent share. And what this one is going to be is we're going to do a little bit of math. Basically, we're going to take 1, which is a whole prize, and divide it by this prize share. And I'm going to go ahead and I selected it here, and now I can insert it. And you can see we're doing 1 divided by prize share, and we don't have any syntax errors, so that we got this little checkbox here. and this is going to create that new column doing that math for us. So for now, so I don't wreck anything after, I'm going to go ahead and remove this column, and I'll create it later. So now I have price share, and I've got entity type, which I want to get rid of. Yes, delete. So now I'm back to, okay, good. So I've got my price share and price percent share, which actually figures it out as a percentage instead of just this whole number, which is not all that helpful. So now what I can do with price share is I can get rid of it. I can say I want to remove it. So in price percent share still works because it's logically you can think about these steps happening in order. So because this step price share existed when I executed this add custom column, now that I'm done with it and I have that custom column, I can remove price share, and this one still works because it was created while price share was there. So this is not necessarily technically exactly how everything is executed in terms of the M code behind the scenes, but logically this is how things happen. So once you're done with a column, even if you've used it for filtering or something else, if you don't want to keep the column itself, you don't have to, which is really, really cool. So what I want to do now, so we've got our price percent share, and awesome. Let me go back to transform. And right now it's any data type. I'm going to make sure it's decimal because that'll make things easier later. And we've got our price categories. Great, we're in great shape. What I'm going to do is I'm going to merge a couple columns. So if we look at first name and last name, I have these two columns. What I'm going to do is I'm going to control-click to select them. And on the Transform tab here, we have this button up at the top under Text Columns for Merge Columns. Basically, it's going to combine the two columns together. So if I click that, we get this Merge Columns dialog here, where we have a number of options. We can choose if we want to have a separator between the two values. In my case, I want a space. And we also have the ability to add a name here. So I'm going to type in full name. So now I'm going to merge first name and last name into a new column called full name, and it's going to be separated with a space. And I'm going to click OK. Notice, here's what's cool. My first name and my last name have now been completely replaced by the new full name column. So I've merged the columns, and they've replaced the original columns. The reason is that I did that on the Transform tab. Suppose that's not what I want. So if I just wanted full name, this would be great, and I wouldn't have the first and last. Suppose I want first, last, and full. I'm going to go ahead and click the X in the lower right here. I'm going to click the X on this step to remove that step because I don't want that. Instead, what I want to do is I want to combine them, but I want to keep the original columns. For that, I can go to this Add Column section of the tab and click Merge Columns. Now I fill it out exactly the same way. The interface is the same. But this time, what happens is it's added as a new column, and the existing ones are preserved. Any new columns are added at the very end. So now I have my full name column at the very, very end. Okay? Pretty cool. Suppose I don't want it at the end. Now, in this case, my data set's small enough I could just drag it where I wanted it to. But if I have a lot of columns, a great option here is the Move option. So if I right-click, I can go to Move, and I can choose where to put this column. I can move it left, I can move it right, I can move it to the beginning or the end. In my case, I'm going to move it to the very beginning, and it's going to become the first column. And now what I'm going to do is I want to put it after last name. So now I'm just going to move it so that that little green bar is after last name. And now I've reordered my columns, and things are happy, and that's what I wanted it to be. Let's, if we look at dates, I have my birth date here, the birth date of the laureates. So if I go to the Transform tab, we can see that this is the any data type, okay, because it wasn't sure what to do with it. It kind of looked like a date, but it was kind of text, and Power Query decided, you know what, I'm not going to bother. I'm not even going to guess. Unlike, you know, trying to do stuff like this with Excel or bring Excel into integration services, there's a lot of guessing that goes on behind the scenes, and that's it can be a bit of a nightmare. So in this case, we have our birth date, and I'm going to actually format it as a date by changing that data type there. Now you can see it's in italics, so it's been changed to a date, which is good. The other thing to note that I hadn't thought of until I tried this, when I brought this data set originally into PowerPivot, the earliest date that you can have inside of PowerPivot is January 1st of 1900. One of the things you're going to see about some of these people here is some of them had the lack of foresight to be born before 1900 in a way that's very, very inconvenient for me. The nerve of these people. So what I need to do is I need to change this birth date because a lot of these are going to generate errors if I try to bring it into PowerPivot. Suppose I just capture the year. The year is just going to be a numeric value, and that's going to be fine. I can do that. So if I have birth date on the I'm on the transform column because I want to replace the transform tab because I want to replace the birth date column with a birth year. And over to the right here, we have these date and time transformations. And you can see this date one is activated. The other ones are grayed out because I don't have any time here. I just have a date. But I can click on this date drop down, and I can say, I just want the year. And wha-bam, my birth date has become just birth year. So now that I've done that, I can actually change it to text, because right now it's a decimal number. I will never, ever, under any circumstances, want to add years together. It's never going to be valid for me. Nor is it going to be valid for my users. So rather than keep it a decimal number, which PowerPivot is going to natively want to start doing math with, I'm going to make it text because it's going to be more like a dimension attribute instead. Once I do that, I can change its name to birth year. I can even spell birth correctly. And now I have my birth year instead of birth date. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Home tab, and I'm going to do Close and Load. Right now you can see it's loading data. It's going back out to the API, and you can see something that has happened here that you didn't see before is I have errors. So I have errors this time in what I was loading to PowerPivot. And we will come back to that in just a second. So we've done our chemical reactions. And just to keep my analogy going, I want to talk about distillation for a moment. So with distillation, it's about separating component substances from a liquid, right? So you do vaporization and condensation, right? You've heard of distilled water. Well, they do that with distillation. And you've heard of distilleries for alcohol, etc. In this case, the way I look at distillation, it's removing the impurities, right? So it's removing, say, the errors from a data set. Okay, that was it. But hey, I thought of it and thought it was cool, so I wanted to play it up. So back into our workbook here, we have our 36 errors. One of the things that I can do is these 36 errors are a hyperlink. So I can actually click on that, and this is going to launch a new query that's isolating from the laureate query. It's using that as a source. It created an index on it, so it added an index number. It's keeping only the errors, and then it reordered columns to move things around to put the row number at the beginning. So you can see we have these errors, and they all seem to be on the birth year column. So if I click on one of these, one of the things that we can see, if I click on that, is that this record had a value of 4 zeros and then 2 zeros for the month and 2 zeros for the day. Obviously, this is not a valid year, so when I convert it to year, this record actually generated an error right there, right then. Now, I don't want to deal with this in this that little interface there. Instead, I'm going to actually double-click to go back into the query. And what I want to be able to do is deal with those errors. So I know they're in birth year because I went and looked at that already. What I can do is I can choose to remove the rows that have errors in them. So if I click this the Remove Errors button, I can click that. And now what that does is the rows that had an error in this column have been filtered out of the data set. They're gone. That's not really what I want. Because even if somebody didn't have, even if somebody didn't have a valid birth date, or as an organization that doesn't have a birth date, even if they didn't have it in there, I want to know that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that step. So I'm going into the query steps here, and I'm going to click on this little delete option for that removed errors because I don't want to get rid of them. Instead, what I want to be able to do is replace the errors. So if I go to transform here, right, I go to the transform tab, I now have this button here, which is really cool, where I can replace that error state with something else. So if I have birth year selected, I go replace errors. So I can replace it. It's letting me select a value to replace the errors with. I can choose like NA or something like that. In this case, because it's a text field, I can actually leave it blank, and I can click OK. And now the rows that would have had errors are going to have text instead. One of the other things that I want to show too is that I didn't do earlier, even though I have my notes printed in front of me, is I want to show you how to sort a data set, because there's a couple of rows in here that are junk rows that we want to get rid of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on prize year, and I'm going to click the little button here, and I'm going to do sort ascending. So we're going to sort by prize year, and now before I do anything else, I'm going to do the same thing for category. And one of the things that you're going to see, if we zoom in a little bit here, is that next to prize year we have a little tiny 1, and next to prize category we have a little tiny 2, and they both have the arrow button indicating that they're sorting ascending. Because I did those exactly one after the other, Power Query determined that I wasn't changing my mind about the sort, but rather I was saying I want to sort first by prize year and then by prize category. And that's really cool that it puts those together. Okay. One of the things that when we do this we can see is that we have some junk rows in the data here where we have nulls and emptiness the whole way across. So one of the things that we can do is we can filter out data, and this is something I typically do earlier on, but I totally spaced it. And if I click on this guy, I can filter out by deselecting the nulls. I can get rid of the records that have a null for first name. I happen to know for all the organizations, the organization name goes in the first name column. So this will preserve my organizations, but get rid of these junk rows at the top. And I click OK, because that's something I should have done earlier. But I can still do it here, and it's still valid. It still works. Okay. So we've gotten rid of our errors, and now if I go home and I go to close and load, it's going to go against the API again, and it's going to load that data to the data model. And this time, as we zoom in, you can see there's no more errors. We dealt with them. Happy days. So if we come back into the slide deck, and we're going to start doing a little bit of advanced topics here. So one of the things that's really cool that you can do within Power Query is you can merge queries together. This is essentially like doing a join within SQL Server. So you pick two tables or two queries, and you decide on what name you want to be, on what field or fields you want to be able to join the two together. And it allows you to bring columns from one query into another query. And this is really, really handy, especially if you have, say you've got a large flat file that, you know, the way you want to model it up, you want to make a star schema out of what's in that flat file. With Power Query and this ability to merge queries, you can actually make the separate tables and bring things in together. It's actually really, really cool that you have this ability. You can also append queries, which is essentially like doing that union all, where you just union things together and basically stack the queries on top of one another. So when you saw me earlier when I did the from folder, behind the scenes essentially what it's doing is it's doing an append of the queries against each of those files, and it's just doing it for us. Really, really cool stuff. And then you have M. Officially it's called the Power Query Formula Language, but it's a lot easier to just call it M, which is kind of the informal nickname for it. M, I believe, it stands for mashup, because in Power Query the engine behind the scenes is called the mashup engine, so I believe that's why it's called M. And so this is actually really cool stuff. We've done a little bit already, and I'm going to show you a little bit more. And I do want to make sure to stress that it is case sensitive. It's really, really important. All right, so advanced topics, demo. So what I want to do is I'm going to open up that query once again. And the entity type column that we created before, we're going to create again because I didn't want to hold stuff up by having it in the wrong place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that new entity type. So I'm going to click to add a column. add custom column, and just to be sure, I'll go back in and grab the code so you don't have to watch me type so much. And entity type. And we looked at it already, so we have the, if the gender is equal to org, then do organization, otherwise individual, we click OK. And now we have our entity type here. We can see we have an organization. We can click in here. We can see that's all we have, or individual and organization. So we know we don't have any error rows or anything like that. Everything's happy. So now what we can do now that we've done that, and we've got our entity type, is we can go into gender. And what I want to do under transform, we want to replace values here. So we still have our org in there as a gender, which doesn't really make sense. It's not a gender. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace values, and I'm going to look for org and replace it for NA, because organizations don't have a gender, so I'd rather call it not applicable than actually leave it as org. And I have the option here if I want to match the entire cell contents when I do this. I don't necessarily need to in this case, but I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now if we come back into the gender column, you can see the domain of values. We have our female, male, and then NA, which is kind of nice. It's cleaner and it makes a lot more sense. All right, so I'm going to come back to the home, and we're going to close and load, and it's going to reload that data, this time with the added steps that we took. And what I'm going to do is, really quick, I'm going to right-click on Laureate, and I'm going to choose Duplicate. Basically, this is going to make an exact copy of Laureate with all its steps all the way back through its source. Going to make a complete duplicate. It's calling it Laureate 2 because it has to be a unique name, and it's loading it to the data model. So I'm going to double-click into this guy. What we're going to do is we're going to turn this copy of the Laureate query actually into an M function, which is really cool. So first, I'm going to change its name to Laureate function. Then I'm going to actually go through and I'm going to do a filter on prize category. So just by deselecting all and say selecting just chemistry and clicking OK, now I've created a step in the query that filters for just prize category. So this query, as it is, will only return the chemistry Nobel Prizes. It won't return any of the others. Okay? In order to actually deal with the M of the whole query, what you do is you go into View, and you have this button for the Advanced Editor, this guy right here. And this is also where you can turn off the formula bar if you don't want to see it. I'm going to go ahead and click on the Advanced Editor, and this is the M code for the entire query. Let me just expand it so we can see everything. Just about everything. Some of it is too wide, but you can see we have, so M starts with a let statement, essentially, and then each step in the query has a name, and each subsequent step refers back to the steps that it needs earlier in the query. And to my understanding, a query step can reference a step later in the query as well. That kind of hurts my brain to think about, so I try not to think about it too much, but just know that just referencing a step by name, you can refer to it, and you can go back and forth, and it's actually really, really cool. And we can see down here, in this section here, this is where we have our prize category equals chemistry filter taking place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type a little bit, and I'm going to say category, so that's going to be the name of the parameter for this function, the argument, category, and I'm going to do an equals with a greater than sign. This is what's telling M, oh, this is going to be a function now, okay? And the parameter it's going to take is category. If I come down here in my code and I replace the hard-coded value of chemistry with category instead, okay, that's telling M, apply whatever value is passed to category, apply that here, and filter by that value. And now I click Done. So now we see we changed, so we now have an invoke function, and our applied steps are just the Laureate function. If I come back to home here, and I click Close and Load, what I'm going to do is it's going to save it, but notice it says connection only. because a function, what it outputs is actually the function itself, a query itself. And what it's going to do is it can't really save that to a table. Instead, what it gives me the option to do is invoke it. So I can invoke this function, and I can pass in, say, piece, and click OK. And that value piece was passed into that function, and now I have a query using that function that gives me the rows, but just for the piece price. That's all that's in here, which is really, really cool. It's nice to have that ability. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this guy out. So M functions are really, really powerful, and I'm still only scratching the surface with M. I'm very much a student of M, but I find it a really, really exciting tool, thing to work with. All right. Advanced topics. We also want to do a bit more query management. So before I go back into there, so now what I want to do is let's do a little bit of summarization, because that's something I haven't done yet. So I'm going to right-click the laureate query, and this time I'm going to choose reference. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a new query using laureate as its source. So all the steps in laureate are not duplicated inside this query, because it's referencing laureate. So laureate can have all the query steps I wanted to set up, and now I can use that externally without duplicating all those same exact steps, which is really cool. So I'm going to go into this guy, and we're going to do some aggregation here. Basically, what I'm going to create is a complete list of the prize years and prize categories that existed, because not all prizes were offered in all years. Some of them weren't there in the beginning, like economics wasn't there at the very beginning, so there's not always going to be a prize for economics for each year, but you'll see why we're doing this in a little bit. So I'm going to click prize year and prize category, and on the home tab I have transformations that happen at this level. I want to do a group by. It's kind of what you think it might be with T-SQL. So if I click group by, it's going to group all the rows by those two columns, and by default it wants to create a count with the number of rows in each of those group bys. In my case, at the moment, I just want that unique list, so I'm going to click this minus, and basically all I'll be creating is a unique list of all the prize year, prize category combinations that exist in my query, and I'm going to click OK, and here they all are. You can see, there's no economics at the beginning here. And I'm going to call this one award summary, and I'm going to close and load, which by default, because I referenced laureate, it wants to go, because of my defaults, it wants to go to the data model. I don't really want it in the data model right now because I want to do other stuff with it first. So one of the things you can do with managing queries is you can right-click and you can change where a query loads. So in my case, I have a query here, but I don't want to load it anywhere right now. So I'm going to click load, and it's telling me, hey, you already loaded this to the data model. That table is going to go away. Are you sure you want to do this? And in my case, the answer is yes. So I'm going to go ahead and continue, and now we can see that it changes to connection only. So this is not loaded anywhere, but the query exists, and I can use it. Okay? Really fun stuff. I'm going to reference laureate again, do another reference, and again, because of my defaults, it's going to load it to the data model. And then I'm going to open it up, and to show you something cool, what I'm going to do is I actually have a query, so I don't have to walk through all the steps, that I'm actually going to go into View, Advanced Editor, and I'm going to replace this with that query that I already did. And what this does is it filters the rows for just the individuals and does a group by on the prize year and prize category with the count and names it individual count. So I'm going to call this individual. So this is going to be a query that's going to output just the individuals and how many Nobel Prizes were won by individuals for each year and for each category. And if I go and close and load, I can also change this one once it's done, so it loads to nowhere. I love that option, the ability to load to nowhere. I found that really handy when I was doing some work against Salesforce objects. to be able to join the things together. I would load them to nowhere. So now I'm going to reference Laureate again. And while that's running, I'm going to go grab the organizations. Come in here, and that's done. So it's great to be able to just paste this in. Because it's all M behind the scenes, it's really, really cool. Just know that if you're modifying what a step did, if you're modifying the M code, and you modify it in such a way that it's something that can't be accomplished with the UI, then you're no longer going to be able to edit that step in the UI. You're going to have to edit it in M from there on. So just know that if you play around with M, you can affect how it works in the UI. But if it's the job that you need to do to get it done, then go for it. It's really cool. In my case, it was just easier to paste this in than to have you watch me do more group bys. And I will actually go back and edit this one because I forgot to name it organization. And we'll close and load. And I will change where it loads so it goes nowhere again. And awesome. So now these are all connections. What I want to be able to do with an award summary is I want to know for each year in each category, I want a separate count for the organizations that won and for the individuals that won. That looks like it would be interesting. So what I'm going to do from inside award summary is I'm going to click this merge queries button over here on combine. So under combine, I have the merge queries. I have the append queries. That combine binaries was used like by the folder where it stacked the files, and I was able to combine them into a single group. That's the combine binaries. In this case, I want to merge. So because I'm in the context of award summary, that's the top table here. Now I select what table I want to merge information from. So first, I'm going to choose individual. So what I want to do to join there is I want to join on prize year. So I click prize year here and prize year in the other one. And now we're joining on prize year. But I also need to join on prize category. So now if I hold down Control and I click prize category and prize category, you'll see what it detected is because I held down Control, it saw that I wanted to join first on prize year and then on prize category. So we have a little 1 and a little 2 there. So it's going to join on both of those in order to be valid. So now I have, because there could be more than one match theoretically, I have a table for each row, and I can click this expand button here, and I can choose what I want to pull in from the other query. I can pull in everything if I want to. In my case, all I want to do is pull in the individual count, and you have the option to prefix the rows, the columns you're bringing in with the name of what they came from. I'm going to deselect that because I just want it called individual count. And I click OK. And for each row, you can see we've got our individual count. So 1901 in physics, there was 1 winner. In 1902 in physics, there was 2, etc. 1903, this was the year Marie Curie won. She's there. So we have our new column. Let's do it again. Let's go get our organizations. And we're going to get our organization count. And again, I'm going to do prize year, and then I do control click on the category to join first on prize year and then on category, and I click OK. And I'll do the same type of thing where I'll deselect, and I just want organization count. And since I deselected this last time, Power Query remembered that and assumed I wanted to deselect it again, so I didn't have to deselect that over again. And now we have our organization count. And just to show it's not all nulls, we have some 1s and 2s in there. So now what I can do with my award summary is I can close and load, and it's still a connection only. Now what I can do is I can change it and say, okay, now load that to the data model, and now I've got an award summary in my data model. So you can see we've got these rows loaded here, those rows loaded here, and I'll go ahead and look at Power Pivot really quick. If I go to Manage, and you'll see that I have the 2 tables. I have our laureate table, which has all the detail, and then we've got the award summary that I created as well. Really cool. So we're just about done, and I'll talk about laboratory safety a little bit. There's a concept called query folding. So when Power Query is querying a relational source, like say a SQL Server database, what it will try to do under the right circumstances is push as much of the processing back into that engine as it can. And really it only works at this point with relational databases. But essentially it will push back. It's called query folding, where it pushes some of the processing back there. Now, those of you that are DBAs and thinking about the little Bobby tables where, you know, somebody named their kid drop table student might be terrified by this, and perhaps you should be. One of the things that happens behind the scenes and that you have the ability to control is how it deals with that and with the private data privacy settings. Because essentially what you want to avoid is having data from a public data source that you may not have fully vetted, passing that information back into your database as part of query folding is kind of terrifying. So this kind of deals with the levels that you can deal with on setting the data privacy for sources. So public data can get data from organizational data and private data, and it can merge into public data, and the public data won't freak out. The organizational data by default is going to not want to deal with public data. It doesn't want to incorporate it natively in the query folding, etc. And the same in private is only going to want to deal with private, not even organizational. So you can actually set these settings, and it will tell Power Query how you want to deal with it. There is an option. What you can do is if you are dealing with data, say all organizational and private data, and you know all the data is trustworthy, and you'd rather have it be faster than deal with those things, you can turn on what's called fast combine. And when you do that, you sacrifice that security to gain performance. So this is something in a situation where you know for sure all of the data is trustworthy and you want to make it go a little bit faster instead, then you can turn that on. Just know, it's going to warn you when you turn that on that you can be improving performance, but you might be sacrificing privacy. But, if it's a situation where you know you're going to be safe to do this, you do have that option. And basically the demo I have for this, I never really got working the way I wanted it to. And it has to do with having a query written just the right way that it tries to break the privacy. And actually I'm just about out of time anyway, so that works out okay. All right, so I have that, I have the file, and at this point I would say, are there any questions that people have? I haven't really been following along with these, been focusing, so are there questions that I can help?
Yep. Someone wants to know if you could source to an iTunes folder to consolidate music metadata.
That is actually really interesting. The thing is, when you source to a folder, what it's going to want to do natively is it's going to want to bring in the data that's in the files. But I suppose if you don't go that far, I would say it would probably take some fun to get around some things. But that seems like a really cool thing to try. I haven't tried it myself, so I don't want to say, oh yeah, it's really easy, here's what you do. But it seems like a logical thing that you might want to give a shot for. That's really cool. Yeah, I haven't tried it, but I can't think of anything necessarily that would make it impossible to do.
Someone wants to know what the maximum number of rows in Excel is.
The maximum number of rows in Excel, from the last time I looked at it with Excel 2013, I want to say it was like 1.3 million rows in a worksheet. However, if you're saving to the data model, you don't have a row limit per se. So in the data model itself, what it uses is the X-velocity engine, kind of like a tabular model behind the scenes. And for that, in 32-bit Excel, I believe you have a 2 GB limit on the amount of data you can have in any one file. On 64-bit Excel, you're really limited only by the memory on the machine on which you're working. So if you want to bring in something huge, you can. I will say with the X-velocity engine, I saw even with Power Pivot back in 2010, which is the same engine, even back then, I saw in Excel 2010 somebody with a couple of billion rows in Power Pivot in Excel 2010. So because of that compression and because of it's not stored as a row set, rather it's columnar storage, that's another advantage of going to the data model is you can have a lot more rows to deal with, even with the amount of space that you have available to you. So that's a huge advantage of not going to a worksheet. But the worksheet, I want to say it's 1.3 million rows, somewhere around there.
Okay. I've had a couple people ask if you're going to make your PowerPoint presentation available.
Yeah, I can totally do that. I think actually I do have it up on my blog, and if I don't, then I will fix that quickly. But yeah, it's a session that I did at Summit, and yeah, I can provide people with a PDF of the PowerPoint, and I've got a file that's basically the end result of everything we did today, an Excel file with the Power Query in there and with the models loaded and everything, and I can include that file as well. Is that something that Liz, that you guys do up on your site, or should I just point people to my blog?
Yeah, we can point it to your blog, and then also if you, because we're definitely not, you have a lot of questions and we're definitely not going to get to them, I can send you a list of the questions, and if you want to answer those in a follow-up blog, we can also post that on our site, so you kind of get,
Beautiful. Yeah, that would be great.
Yep.
Yep, that would be excellent.
Okay, and like I said, sorry, we're out of time, everybody. I know that there was a lot of questions, so I'll be sure to get those to Mark by the end of the week, so he can answer those for you in a blog. But if you have any questions in the meantime, I know Mark provided his email, and you can always contact us directly at Pragmatic Works. But if you're not following us on social media, please do so. That is the best way to stay informed on when we post things about our free training, especially follow-up blogs and things like that. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I had a great time.
Thanks.